The webinar that you have joined us to view today is entitled The Resilience of the Internet's Infrastructure During COVID-19. My name is Christian Dawson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Internet Infrastructure Coalition. Today, I've got 4 esteemed panelists, leaders in the Internet infrastructure industry that you're going to meet in a little bit. Their names are Alyssa Starzak from Cloudflare, Graham Bunton with 2 Cows, Jane Shee with Endurance International Group, and Alyssa Miller with DKIX. So let me take a moment to start out by telling you why we're all here together. I'll start out by telling you who the Internet Infrastructure Coalition is. The Internet Infrastructure Coalition goes by the name I2 Coalition, and we're the voice of the businesses that build the Internet's infrastructure. We're talking not about the broadband pipes that you get into your home. And we're not talking about the platforms that provide you content on an ongoing basis. We're talking about the companies that rack and stack servers and data centers and that provide the various, what I call the nuts and bolts of the internet in various capacities in order to make the internet run on a daily basis. Types of companies in that space include internet exchange points, domain registries and registrars, web hosting companies, cloud infrastructure companies, virtual private network companies, and various cybersecurity organizations, and organizations like that. These internet enterprises are an extremely important part of how the internet functions. And the work that we are doing to make sure that everybody stays connected is more important than ever. We are realizing the importance of what it is we do as our work is enabling people to continue their lives as they're home during this pandemic. So what we've done today is we as a trade association have brought together some experts who are on the ground and working on various aspects of the internet's infrastructure to tell you guys some stories and provide you some good news about how the internet is working well under these new conditions. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to call on our panelists one by one to tell a little bit of their story from their perspectives. They'll introduce themselves and give you a little perspective on the internet from their the angle that they're going to talk about from the internet's portion of the internet's infrastructure that they work on. And after that, we're going to have a little panel discussion, and I'll lead you guys in a series of questions so that we can find out a bit more about what's really happening on the internet today. Those of you who are here with us can contribute your own questions. There is a button, there's a window that you can hit, a little triangle, you can hit questions, and then that'll give you an opportunity to type in your question. And we'll try to get to as many as we can after we've done the presentations. But let's start with the first presentation now. I'd like to ask Alyssa Starzak from Cloudflare to set the scene for us a little bit and talk to us a little bit about what we've been seeing on the internet's infrastructure since the beginning of this pandemic.
Terrific. Thanks, Christian. I'm Alyssa Starzak. I'm head of public policy at Cloudflare. We are an internet security and performance company. We run a large global network around the world. So we actually have a fair amount of insight into what's happening from a traffic pattern standpoint, which I want to talk about. So we can move to the next slide. So I think what we've seen, which has been pretty well reported, but we have seen as well, is a massive surge in internet usage since the beginning of the pandemic. We've seen something like 40%. These different colored lines represent different companies or different countries. And what you actually see are different spikes in time depending on when we saw shutdowns. So typically when there was a shutdown, we'd see a sort of spike in internet usage. But overall, globally, we've seen a massive increase in internet usage, which is probably not surprising. We've also seen a change in traffic patterns. So for example, there's a lot more traffic in the afternoon than there used to be. It used to be that traffic would spike in the evenings based on when people would actually do streaming video. Now we actually see traffic during the workday, which is a pretty substantial difference. The interesting thing about the 40% number is that it's hard to imagine that in context what that means from a traffic standpoint. But imagine anything that you're doing on a global basis increasing at a 40% capacity or a 40% amount, and thinking about whether something could actually surge to that capacity. The fact that the internet has actually done that over the course of the pandemic is a pretty significant piece. So let's move to the next slide. So the interesting thing generally over what has happened since the beginning of the pandemic has been that the internet has actually worked to that capacity. So the internet has been largely resilient. We have seen some challenges online, but largely they haven't been the internet's fault. So when we think about the internet, we actually think about the big pipes that run through and whether things are moving smoothly or not. Most of the challenges that we've seen have been on the enterprise side, or a particular business can't handle an increase in traffic, for example. So some of the most high profile things, this is an example of the New Jersey Labor and Workforce Development site going down, were just about the way the enterprise itself was set up. They weren't about the ability to move traffic through those pipes, which has actually worked remarkably well. Next slide. The other thing that we've seen over the course of the pandemic, since we've gone into shutdown, is just an increase in threat traffic. And in many ways, this isn't surprising. What we've seen is that higher internet usage has motivated more distributed denial of service attacks, which are essentially overflow attacks. The interesting thing for us in just looking at patterns is that what we've generally seen is that they're smaller, the DDoS type patterns that we've seen have been smaller and shorter. It sort of looks like people are testing things out to see whether somebody might be vulnerable to an attack, for example. So what we've seen is sort of this massive spike, but it's really extended up at least a 20% increase over the course of the pandemic. The larger attacks that we've seen have largely been attacks that are using compromised IoT devices, which is a long-term issue for the health of the internet. But they've largely been mitigated, and most of the mitigation services, which Cloudflare is one of, it's something that actually can be relatively easily mitigated through cloud services. Going on to the next slide. The other thing that we've seen are the change in the type of attack types. So one of the things that we saw when people moved to home, the type of attacks actually changed. So the cyber attacks were actually designed to address home networks. So they were sort of cheap attacks in some ways. They were using old browser vulnerabilities, for example, a variety of other things that are really more likely to work if people are working from home. Moving to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about why we were able to scale to a 40% increase. And this sort of fits into the broader resilience of the internet. So what we saw, and you don't often think about why the internet works the way it does, but what we've seen is that the ability to move around congestion, so the ability to have large global networks that actually move around traffic when things start to get congested, you find another path. The ability to do open data flows and the ability to interconnect in lots of places has actually helped ensure that people can stay online. So to give you an example, one of the things that we don't often think about in this space is just the change in patterns that we've had in the last 10 years, for example, on the internet. The amount of traffic that flows through now versus what went through the internet 10 years ago, it's been exponential in the amount of traffic that we have. But we still have managed to handle it because of the way the internet scales, which is in part due to the fact that we can actually move traffic around like this. It's also, going to the next slide. It's also based on actually how we manage traffic. So one of the things that's actually surged during the pandemic is an increase in streaming. So we've seen this massive increase in streaming overall. People are looking at videos. People are doing a variety of things online that involve streaming services. Those are things that would not be readily accessible in the way that they have been during the course of the pandemic if it weren't for caching. So what caching does is it stores a local copy of something so that a user doesn't have to, the traffic for the video, for example, or for the image doesn't have to travel as far across the internet. The ability to do that has actually been incredibly useful during a time of traffic surge, because what it means is that the traffic that's flowing over the pipes that might be more likely to get congested, so for example, undersea cables, don't get congested because you're only actually going to a local site as opposed to all the way across the ocean. The same thing on cloud services. The ability to actually have something in the cloud that surges with capacity has been an incredibly helpful thing just in terms of the resilience of the internet. Next slide. One of the things that we've been thinking about a lot are ways to further increase reliability and security. There are a couple things that we have on here. One of the pieces that we've actually thought a lot about are things like securing foundational internet protocols. So improving BGP, making sure it's secure so that traffic doesn't go in place that it wasn't supposed to. And I could talk about more about that, but I know that's getting into some of the technical details, so I won't right now. But happy to talk about that more if people have questions. And then things like just modernizing architecture. So modernizing the IT space for things like cloud-based services so that they can address that area where I showed that things hadn't always worked. If you can actually address a surge on that at that end by using cloud architecture, you actually solve some of the challenges that we did see during the pandemic. Next slide. That's it.
And that takes us to the end of the overview that gets us set up for the areas that we want to talk about on today's webinar. Thank you so much, Alyssa, for walking us through what's been going on the internet writ large. Now we're going to turn to our next panelist, who's going to talk about what's happening at the DNS level, the domain name system level. When people use the internet, they generally do so using human readable domain names, like, for instance, i2coalition.com, which is our website, which you should go to and explore. Well, that maps to an internet protocol address, an IP address, and that system's called the DNS. And Graham, you can tell you a little bit about his company. It works in the DNS, and you can talk about the various aspects of how that is dealing with the resilience during COVID-19.
Sure. Thanks, Christian. So hi all, my name is Graham. I'm from Two Cows. Two Cows is the second largest domain name registrar in the world. Probably people are more familiar with the largest, which is GoDaddy. And what we do is we serve, and Two Cows is maybe a bit different in that we're mostly wholesale, but we allow people to purchase and manage domain names, which is distinct from building websites. It's probably a bit of detail we don't need to go into too much today. So I was, up until about 2 weeks ago, the head of let's call it an industry association representing most ICANN accredited domain registrars. So I have a pretty broad registrar experience over this COVID-19 pandemic, which I think has been a really interesting position. So if we can go to that next slide, please. Great. So this slide is really about what domain name registrations look like under COVID. You know, looking backwards, we saw so this data is from my own company. We saw our first registration on January 22nd. It was about March 15th or so that we realized there was something interesting and new and different going on. About mid to late March for most registrars, we saw that daily registration volume peak. And it's been dwindling off since then. Often when there's sort of a global event, think Olympics, think World Cup, even more recently Black Lives Matter, we'll see some smattering of domain registrations related to that, usually a handful. It was looking backwards about March 15th that we realized, boy, this is something really new and really different that we haven't seen before, where we're getting not just a handful, sort of 5, 10, a dozen, something like that. We're getting hundreds of new registrations a day. And that, for the DNS industry, presented an interesting challenge because, you know, we want to make sure that we're being responsible and careful in our domain registrations and that they're not leading to more or some DNS abuse or even content abuse. So if we can move to that next slide, please. There's a title on here I think you can't see at the top that says collaboration. There was a number of activities that took place in the sort of peak of this, of the domain registration volume surge, where the ICANN Registrar Stakeholder Group published a paper to sort of share some best practices with the industry as best we could. And we really began collectively as an industry to interact with local and relevant law enforcement agencies and governments. I'd call out the FBI in particular, as well as US FTC as being really engaged and interactive and helpful in this process. RCMP and Trade in Canada were useful, as well as Europol and the Metro Police in London. So we really had some good discussions with law enforcement and government about, boy, this is a new and unprecedented scenario. We're seeing huge volumes of domain registrations. How do we make sure that we're communicating effectively, sharing threats, and responding appropriately? You know, doing that real good balance between sort of ensuring we're getting bad actors offline as quickly as possible, and that we're protecting people doing new and interesting things with the internet to try and help mitigate dangers and issues related to COVID. A lot of that involved the sharing and development of lists of abusive domain names, so that would be interactive with cybersecurity professionals a lot. And I will say that that was a really interesting experience. People were creating lists very quickly in the very early days of the pandemic, and their quality was extremely low. And so for registrars to act on them, we were at real risk of removing useful domains and good domains or websites from the internet. In my own company, we had examples of, my hunch is the trend was that people were sick or working from home and didn't have the regular access that they needed to build things for could be their local government, it could be a hospital, on their own regular infrastructure. And what we were seeing seemed to be that these institutions were just using third parties to build up a new website to get some information online quickly. And so, for instance, we had a whole bunch of hospitals build COVID websites on website builder products. We ended up with the official South African COVID website on our platform, and we also saw those showing up on lists as abusive. And so we were taking a very careful approach in responding to these, and we saw this across the industry as well. Many registrars came together, I think it was in October last year, to build something called the DNS Framework on Abuse. You should be able to Google that and find it relatively easily. Framework on DNS Abuse, might have those words backwards. And it sets out a number of principles on when and how registrars are going to act on abusive domain names for DNS abuse, so technical abuse, as well as abuse where we think humans are potentially being harmed. And that really came to play a bit in COVID because we were really concerned about things like fake tests and fake cures and what that could mean for people. So we can go to the next slide. So this is sort of the results of that work. It turns out that abusive domains were just a tiny fraction. So while there was a large amount of domain names registered, most of them, somewhere north of 70%, were actually just parked. They weren't doing anything. And we found in our own review that it was less than 0.5% were actually doing something that, using a broad definition of harm, could have been problematic. And in our interactions with law enforcement, and as those lists of abusive domain names matured and got cleaner and better, it turns out that really there was very little actual harm or abuse happening. We saw some shift in DNS abuse, and now I'm speaking at two cows, the sort of phishing and malware, where the actual absolute number went down, but I don't think that was statistically significant, but we did see a small shift in terms. So the number didn't change overall. We just saw them targeting COVID a little bit more. But by and large, the story is that despite that huge volume of registrations, there was not a material increase in abusive registration. So that was good news. Next slide, please. This is there's a title here called Gaps, which was really, this was about, now that we're a little bit beyond that surge, we can do a look backwards and what worked and what didn't. And the industry needs to do more of this, and we're going to keep coming back to it. But I talked about this a little bit already. The initial list that people were trying to create of potentially harmful domains were of low quality. And we need to think about how to improve the quality faster of those lists to ensure that we're not doing more harm than good in taking websites off the internet. And also, it's really worth re-emphasizing here that we saw an immense amount of good things done with those domain names. From the hospitals and, the official South African example I mentioned earlier, but also people doing like interesting art projects and coordinating in their communities. Those things I think were really powerful and good and showed, really what the internet is capable of. One of the other interesting things that came out of this was, registrars, as we're reviewing these registrations, looking for potential harm for both a technical abuse as well as what I would call a content abuse, where people are maybe selling, fake tests and fake cures and stuff like that, was that we were running into lots of gray areas. It would be products or offers that we weren't capable of discerning if they were harmful or not. And we're looking to send those somewhere. And so we had some traction with trade and the FBI in the US, but there were really large gaps around the world where people were targeting a particular geography, and we needed to work on that and really work with governments now, I think, to get, I think a single point of contact is probably too much to ask, but really a better way to send these things that we don't understand to someone else who's better at assessing whether they're going to be harmful or not. Examples of weird stuff might be like we had someone selling COVID-proof tents, as in like kind of like a camping tent, but it was like positive pressure and you could go in there and be COVID safe, and they were very expensive. And I, have no idea whether that's true or not, whether it's fraud, whether it's a false claim, whether it's a legitimate thing. And so who's responsible for looking at that stuff? And can we do a better job of coordinating with those people? So overall, I think the message there was a large volume of registrations. Registrars did a really good job of working with law enforcement, I would say, and law enforcement did a pretty good job of working with us to tackle any abusive registrations that we found. But by and large, there wasn't really very much that was causing a problem. And and on the other side, there was way more good than bad. Thanks.
Thank you, Graham, very much. And it feels good to be able to convey that to people. It sounds as though the industry is approaching this new situation in a thoughtful, effective, and proactive way. And that's a very important message to convey. And I thank you for bringing it to us today. We're now halfway through introducing our panelists and the perspective that they bring to the continued resilience of the internet's infrastructure during COVID-19. I want to remind you all that you can ask your questions, and as soon as we finish these extended introductions, we're going to get to those questions. So feel free to start typing them out right away as you hear something and you want to learn more. We are here to engage you with our stories, but also to answer your questions. So shoot. The next panelist that I want to introduce you to is Jane Shi. Jane Shi is with Endurance International Group. Endurance International Group does web hosting and cloud hosting. It's another very important part of the internet's infrastructure. We just talked about domain names. Now we're talking about your home on the internet, the place where you can put your business or your blog or something like that. And so, Jane, can you share with us your perspective on what it is we have been doing in this industry in that space during COVID-19?
Yep, happy to. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and my apologies for not having slides. I'm Deputy General Counsel of Endurance, and I'm terrible at PowerPoint, so I don't have any. But I guess before I start, just the legal disclaimer I have to make, of course, is that what I talk about here, they're my own views, not those of the company. And I'll also draw on just some research and stuff that I've been reading about the industry as a whole, as well as customer experiences that aren't necessarily always our customers, but again, they are indicative of the industry. So a little bit about Endurance. We actually work with both Cloudflare and Tucows, but we offer online solutions such as web hosting, domain registration, and email marketing. And Endurance is the corporate name, but our brands are like Constant Contact does email marketing, Bluehost for web hosting, and Domain.com does domain name registration. And we have a number of others as well. We support approximately 5 million SMBs, nonprofits, and individual subscribers, and we're based in Burlington, Massachusetts, but in the U.S. we also have operations in Arizona, Texas, Utah, and Colorado, and our customers are, of course, from all over the United States and around the world. In terms of cloud resilience, which is what Christian asked me to talk about, I want to talk about two aspects of it. The first is the resilience of the cloud technology itself, which Alyssa spoke to in the context of Cloudflare. And then the second is the resilience in the ability we have to help small businesses transition to an online model. In terms of the cloud technology itself, many internet companies, including ours, are designed to handle surges, such as the traffic surges that Alyssa talked about. And really, this is part of our standard resiliency planning. So in our case, in the context of shared web hosting, for example, which is a super cheap service that you can get, for $5 a month, we'll store the files that make up your website on a server along with, maybe a few hundred other customers. Where the resiliency comes in is if any one of those websites starts to see a surge in traffic, maybe it has really helpful information about COVID or whatever the reason is, our technology can kind of identify that and redistribute resources so that that one website doesn't adversely affect all the other customers on that same server. And the same type of concept also applies with our email marketing. So again, as part of our standard technology, Constant Contact was designed to handle surges in email sends around the holidays, for example, where we know that customers are sending a lot of emails. And this same infrastructure, thankfully, was also able to handle the surge in email sends that came with an unforeseen circumstance such as COVID. So again, it's not like any one of us planned for a pandemic of this scale, but I think just the way that the services were engineered, we were able to handle this pretty seamlessly. So the last part of the resiliency in terms of the tech that I just want to mention is I think we're very fortunate that because we don't deal in kind of physical goods or services, our teams were really able to transition seamlessly to a work from home model. I think within a couple of weeks, and by mid-March, our entire workforce of like 3,000 or so employees were able to work remotely in a secure manner. And this has allowed the company to take a safety and family first approach to our workforce while at the same time continuing to provide support to our customers who kind of need us most at this stage. And this brings me to the second part, which is the resiliency of small businesses that I think the cloud infrastructure supports. So unlike prior recessions, which I think took a little bit longer to set in, with COVID, small businesses were really forced to change their business models overnight. I don't know what your guys' experience was like, but I remember with me, it was like on a Thursday, I was figuring out whether or not I can send my son to hockey practice, and by the next day, everything in Boston was shut down and everyone was working from home, which was really remarkable that all happened, pretty smoothly. And so we saw businesses moving online at a faster rate than in the past. One statistic I saw was that we saw 10 years of e-commerce growth compressed into 8 weeks between March and the end of April, which is really remarkable. And I'm sure you've all seen this with your favorite restaurants or neighborhood grocery stores and others moving to online models, providing the ability to add online purchasing or ordering functionality and curbside pickup. And so I just wanted to end with one story that actually the New York Times featured in their tech newsletter, and it's about a restaurant in Brooklyn where, like many other restaurants, most of its business pre-COVID was from dine-in customers. And when the pandemic hit, the restaurant tried a number of delivery apps, but they were kind of expensive. They weren't easy to navigate. They couldn't easily update menu items or advertise specials. And so what they discovered was that they really needed to be able to communicate quickly and to their customers directly. So they stood up a very basic e-commerce website, dusted off an old email address list, and then they were able to, through this process, sell, groceries, take out meals, do promotions, and talk about popular dishes that have returned. As a result, this particular restaurant was able to keep about half of its sales from pre-COVID times, which, is not perfect, but still allowed it to survive. And importantly, it was also able to take approximately 95% of its sales directly rather than through some app companies. So again, it's just one example of how the internet infrastructure is helping support the resiliency of small businesses. And I think in the panel discussion later, we can talk a bit more about this trend. And I think one positive aspect is hopefully this will provide an additional source of revenue for some of these small businesses that'll stick past the pandemic.
Jane, I thank you very much for that report. It very much makes me feel good to be part of an industry that has something to offer, something that can help people during this critical time. And the anecdotes that you provide and the data that you provided here certainly showcase that this industry has been there to help small businesses move forward. Our last panelist that we're going to introduce you to is going to talk about yet another aspect of the internet's infrastructure that has needed to maintain its resilience in order to make sure that we can continue to do that for businesses. Alyssa Miller represents DKIX, which is an internet exchange point. The internet is said to be a network of networks, and an internet exchange point is, to put it simply, a place where the network of networks meet and exchange, and the content delivery networks and the ISPs exchange internet traffic between those networks. So Alyssa, perhaps you can tell us more and talk to us about what you've been seeing on the ground there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christian. And thank you, Alyssa, Graham, and Jane, for all your insights. You can go to the next slide here. So, here at DKIX, just to give you a perspective of who we are the largest neutral, carrier and data center neutral provider of internet exchanges, and Christian really put it so nicely. We're a network of networks. We really enable networks to meet each other through internet exchange hubs and points. And it's not just interconnecting with networks. It's interconnecting to content providers, cloud providers, and all of those companies that actually operate their own network infrastructure. They have to have an AS number, an asynchronous network number. They have to be able to do BGP, and we actually have these internet exchange points in over 22 markets throughout the world, providing access for over 2,000 networks to interconnect. And so some of the data points that I'm about to share with you are really interesting and quite mirror what Alyssa shared with us earlier in the program. So if you can go to the next slide. So just to reiterate, part of the DKIX infrastructure was we were prepared. In other words, we had to fortify and always have to fortify our network capabilities to make sure that all of the networks that are interconnected at our global hubs remain live and enabled to do their business. So this just reiterates, our resiliency as a provider to assure that. And we're always making sure that we have excess capacity available on our infrastructure. For instance, you see there we have an average use capacity of about 63% and an average of 37% capacity free. Next slide. So, similar to what Alyssa mentioned earlier, Cloudflare saw about 40% average traffic increase. And within our platform, we saw about 50% average traffic increase in just a matter of weeks. And we had 100% increase of traffic on collaborative tools and streaming. And so again, reiterating what Alyssa mentioned earlier, think about how much capacity and how much utilization of that collaborative tools and streaming services there must be to have it actually more than double, right? It's 100% increase. We also realized 8 peak traffic records across our distributed infrastructure, which is also remarkable in such a short period of time. And we're really proud to say that we had no interruption of service. Next slide. So here's just some, interesting kind of comparisons of, what we saw before versus what we saw after. If we look at internet usage as itself, right, it is a mirror of our lives, and it's a mirror of what we actually do in person. And so it makes a lot of sense that that transferred online. So before the crisis, we saw that internet usage was about 10 to 50% peak increase per year. And that's actually, an okay, and standard type of growth. But what we saw during the COVID crisis, a 10 to 50% average increased traffic in a matter of days. And that's really remarkable. And from what Jane's stats say, that really reiterates, the immense amount of use and pivot for businesses in transferring how they conduct their business online. Before the pandemic, we saw steady growth, new peaks in the fall and winter, and again, similar to the data points that Alyssa showed us earlier, we saw that the new peaks correlated with the lockdowns and when those went into place. And so that was really interesting to observe. Before the pandemic, stable distribution of traffic applications versus now that extreme rise of applications like collaborative tools, gaming, and video. Really interesting statistics on that. And similar to some of the data points that Alicia shared earlier, the diurnal cycles, the morning and night lows that we would traditionally see prior to the pandemic were significantly more during the days and higher amplitudes with higher peaks that we were observing. Next slide, please. So you can go to the next slide. So here are some of the learnings and takeaways that we believe in and are really important for the global infrastructure community. Listen, in a time of a crisis, a global lockdown needs a digital unlocking. Really important. We need to empower and enable and provide access to as many people as we possibly can. And a lockdown does not mean a shutdown, right? With this infrastructure that all these great companies are enabling and empowering, this allows us that continuity of social activities, of business activities, schooling, online learning, and health. And this is all being enabled through the digital infrastructure, which is just remarkable. And it gives us kind of a peek into what the future could look like with what is being enabled out there. We've also kind of learned that, digital applications are really crucial for enabling business and private life. I mean, it reiterates just what I said. But when we have to function and we have to be able to do business, cloud-based applications, collaborative tools, social media, streaming, and gaming, those are all ways that feed our social appetites as well as business enablement, and tries to simulate, like that mirror, simulate that physical world online. And the great news, again, I know Alyssa touched on this earlier, but that digital infrastructure that's in place is really formidable. It was ready and it has absorbed the uptick in demand, and it will continue to do so. Next slide, please. So, as we take a look forward, right, as I mentioned, have we peeked into the future of what this all might look like? And, here at DKICS, we see that it is a new era, and as a result, we have to make this a new deal. Communication behaviors will significantly change in the long term. All of this is propelling, getting businesses and individuals a lot more comfortable with this online digital universe that we're in. And these digital worlds will continue to complement the physical life, remote working, less business travel, and less commuting, and enable people a lot more flexibility in their day-to-day lives. We're also seeing enterprises and institutions accelerating their digital transformation. Many of them are already in the midst of it or have been in the flow of it, but they have to adapt and change a little bit because it could get very expensive for these businesses if they're not being smart about how they're implementing and adapting solutions. And then, from the standpoint of investment decisions into this infrastructure, we really believe that the government and the internet industry must make it their mandate to enable digital infrastructure everywhere. I know it's something that everyone is working on, but this situation that we're in has only highlighted the digital divide for those underserved markets and hard to reach locations. And I think it would be remiss if we did not take this as a learning experience to really see where we can be better for the world to enable and bring access to this digital infrastructure so that we don't have that disparate, chance for businesses and individuals to thrive. So, as a result, digital everywhere for everybody is really, what we are advocates of. Next slide. And I'm going to leave this with everybody because I thought this was so apropos, right? JFK was quoted as saying, when written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters. One represents danger and the other represents opportunity. And I think that this pandemic, this global proliferation of this virus has really presented us a collective opportunity to identify ways that we could work better, that we can build this infrastructure and enable many more businesses to thrive in a new digital era. And thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. That's fantastic. What a great message to leave us on. We're going to take the next 10 minutes or so asking our esteemed panelists who've just spent some time meeting a couple of questions to close us out. And this is an up for grabs, free for all section. Anybody can answer if they have a good answer to the questions that we're going to ask. My questions are the questions that are submitted by our audience today. What I find really interesting is that the internet's infrastructure is very diverse. It's an extremely important part of how the internet works, but there's lots of different companies doing lots of different things. You guys come from very different perspectives, but the message was very aligned, that the systems are working, that they're able to scale, and that we are in a position to help, and indeed we are helping. My big question that I want to ask you guys now centers around something that Jane said, and that's that there's this idea that 10 years of digitization seem to be compressed in the first 8 weeks of this. Is that pace continuing? And if that pace is continuing, or even anything close to it, can we keep it up? Are we able to sustain that pace of quick digitization?
I'll jump in. So, I've been watching quotes. I think Microsoft's CEO was quoted as saying that digital transformation accelerated during the pandemic, 2 years in a matter of weeks. Dropbox was quoted as saying similar things. So we are seeing that acceleration. And I've thought about that a lot. And I do think that we are going to continue to see acceleration, but it's going to level off for sure. That leveling off will be that new high point. And then we're going to go back to the same type of pre-COVID growth levels that we saw, right? That 10 to 40, 10 to 50% growth in a matter of a year. But we're going to be much higher in that traffic utilization rates I don't think it's going to level off at all. I don't think it's going to claw back, but I'm open to being debated on that. I think it's just going to grow from there, but again, leveling off in the growth trajectories.
My sense is also, I completely agree. My sense is that one of the things that's happened in the time of the pandemic is that people have realized it sort of brought home, why was there this massive spike in usage? Why was there this sense of need to move to the cloud sort of very quickly? It's brought home that the risks of not being in that space. And so what you had is sort of the initial assessment of risk and the understanding of we need to do digital transformation very quickly to the extent that we can. What you're going to have, I think, in the future is the entities that are needed to do it in a more steady way, needed to sort of think through that process a little bit more, needed to go through couldn't do it quickly, for example. So I think that's the steady growth that Alyssa was talking about. It's the reality that people know that this is something now that is really an important thing that they need for their business, for their institutions, for stability and reliability. So it's an awareness now, and I think that will continue to grow, just not at quite the same rate.
Yeah, I think too. I'm not sure if the pace will stay there, but one of we always think about like who is our customer base and how do we help them in particular in this time. The small businesses and micro businesses, right? And so some of the statistics we've seen floating around, for example, are like 30% of small businesses are still without digital tools. And yet 70% of small businesses who have them say that they would have been really useful. It is very useful for them to have these tools, and they might be out of business without them. So I think that's like a little bit of the opportunity that is still there for us if we can reach those small businesses and help them stay in business and support their communities. So I guess it's a slightly different way of looking at your question.
That's helpful. Here's my next question. Because now we see a lot more people sitting at home, and when they're at home, even if they've digitized their business experience, they don't have the same kind of access to a robust IT security that they might have in the workplace. And so what can we say, what can we offer to people who have cybersecurity concerns as they head into this period of rapid digitization to assuage their fears that there are paths forward that will keep them safe?
So I think there are two components to that. I think that there is what can an individual do at home to secure their own networks, and there are some basic sort of cybersecurity things that they should do. They should make sure that they have that they change their passwords on their router, that they some very basic things. I think that there's a separate set of questions on the enterprise side, which is how do you actually facilitate people working from home? And there are actually a lot of digital products. I think again, going back to the difference from 10 years ago to where we are now, there are all these products now that actually can extend security to a variety of different environments. So we're in a different world than we used to, and that's an area that's also growing. So, for example, zero trust security, zero trust architecture is a very useful work from home thing to have. There are a variety of things that you can actually apply to networks that look a lot different than it would look if it were not a cloud environment, for example. So being able to do things in a home environment if you're working from home, so how do you get into your corporate network to use a VPN? What does that look like? How do you speed that up and make it feel not clunky? There's a whole range of things that work for businesses in the work from home category. I think there's also just, again, the other thing that they should emphasize are everybody at home should take some basic cybersecurity protocols, make sure your passwords are good, can change your passwords, secure your router, go through just a sort of basic checklist, make sure you have two-factor authentication. So a very basic checklist of cybersecurity pieces that I think businesses can help their employees who are working from home to institute.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that, training and awareness are so key, right? Because social engineering and phishing are such big parts of how some of these bad actors are successful. And I think being in this industry, sometimes we take for granted, like feel like I'm pretty good at spotting something fake, but then, you know, my husband will be on his phone being like, oh, hey, what is this? Apple told me that I need to reset my, it's like, no, please stop. So I think just educating yourself and maybe a little bit of paranoia is a healthy thing in this regard.
Maybe a brief positive tidbit that came out of the DNS industry regulator is called ICANN, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. There was a virtual meeting of the ICANN and its community 2 weeks ago now, I think. Time has no meaning anymore, as I'm sure we're all aware. You know, one of the most central conversations to that meeting was around DNS abuse, and you know, so that would be like technical abuse that uses the DNS. That's going to be like botnets, malware, phishing, and the sort of technical function of ICANN revealed in a number of presentations that actually overall DNS abuse is down now. So you know, industry efforts to try and protect people and ensure that the internet is a safe space appear to be working, which is good news.
That's fantastic. Look, just a super quick question to push back on that. We can move on very quickly, but just hang in the realm of anti-abuse, because we did focus most of our answer on, from a user perspective, how you deal with cybersecurity issues and abuse issues online. But then we talked at the end about industry efforts. Is there anything that the industry needs from other communities, governments, what have you, to be able to better move those efforts forward?
Oh, good question. There's lots. You know, time and resources are always scarce, at least within the ICANN community, for registrars to keep moving forward on DNS abuse efforts. You know, I don't have like a concrete answer for that. You know, out of COVID, and I think I said this a little bit in my presentation, is continuing to make more robust the sort of communication pathways, I think, between law enforcement and internet infrastructure, as well as between cybersecurity and the internet infrastructure world. And it feels like that should be in place and robust already. One of the things I think we learned in the pandemic was there's a lot of people that would call themselves cybersecurity experts, but it's a, for lack of a better word, like an unregulated industry. And so there was lots of stuff happening and people felt really energized that they wanted to do things about COVID and online abuse. But the sort of technical skills were maybe missing in some of that, and it really muddied the waters. And so figuring out experts, clearing up those lines of communication, I think is going to help people be more effective quicker. Great.
That's helpful. My next and maybe final question, depending on how quickly we go, we've touched on a couple of things that could get into the realm of policy or governance or best practices related topics. And I wanted to ask you guys if you had some thoughts that you to share around encryption. Is there anything you can comment on regarding how providers in the internet infrastructure space use strong encryption to keep users safe, and whether we've determined even more than whether we're seeing in the post-COVID-19 environment that's even more important than ever?
I mean, I think I talked a little bit about our entire workforce being remote, which, you know, I'm sure is true of many tech companies, but I think the ability for them to do that and continue to support our customers, where customers might be passing personal information or whatever information there is to help them with their websites, whatever other tools, I think you absolutely need really, you know, VPN safe encrypted communications. Not only for the obvious reason of keeping that information safe away from hackers, but also I think to continue to build confidence that people can transact digitally, and that, you know, that'll be a safe place to be. So
Yeah, I completely agree with Jane. I think one of the challenges that we've seen is that because everyone's working from home, encryption has become so much more of an important piece. It's the only way people really can get into their systems and have any confidence that those communications aren't being sort of advertised to the internet. I think it's really one of the things that's actually empowered the ability to keep the economy going, because people feel like it's possible to work from home. I think if we were not in that environment because people were concerned about the security of those communications, it would be a much more, we would not be able to actually transition as much online as we have.
I don't have anything to add to Alyssa's excellent answer.
That's a great thing to end us on, Graham. Thank you. Thanks to all our incredible panelists, and thanks to our participants, our attendees here for today's webinar on the resilience of the internet during COVID-19. These experts represent 4 companies that are members of the I2 Coalition and operators within the internet's infrastructure. The I2 Coalition has around 100 member companies. We're full of experts. And if you go to i2coalition.com, there are lots of calls to action how you can get to tell you how you can get a hold of us, and we can put you in touch with experts to help answer more of your questions about the internet's infrastructure, about the importance of what it is we are doing. I think that what you heard from these panelists today is it is an explanation of why what we are doing is so important for the economies of the world right now, for the businesses of the world right now, how we are doing it in a way that continues to be scalable, that continues to provide lots of future opportunity that will be taken advantage of as people continue to digitize not only their businesses, but their needs for education and healthcare, and government services. Lots of different aspects of the way that we interact as humans are going to continue to need to leverage the internet's infrastructure at all different levels. And we are prepared. We are ready, and we're dealing with things responsibly. So we as an association seek to be the voice of the types of companies that are going out there and doing that good work. We want to continue to engage with you. We're going to post this webinar online. We're hoping that you can help us share it. Send it to your friends. Tell them to check out what it is we have to say. Then email us your questions, contact us, and figure out how you can be a part of our community. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to all. Let's go out there and continue to do great work.
You got it.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.